My name is Clara Whitaker. I was 33 when my mother made me feel like a guest at my own father's funeral. She did it quietly, the way she did most cruel things. No raised voice, no scene. It was just a folded program pressed into my hand near the church doors. A soft instruction came with 2 fingers on my elbow. "Family sits in the first row," she said. "You'll be right behind the cousins, right behind the cousins." The program bent in my fingers. Somewhere behind me, white lilies filled the entryway with that sweet, heavy funeral smell. The little travel clock in my coat pocket tapped once against my phone. I had carried it all morning without knowing why. It was old, silver, scratched along one side, the kind of clock people used before everything became an app. My father had given it to me years ago. The hands were stopped at 9:17. My father, Daniel Whitaker, had been dead for 4 days. And somehow, even in death, there was still a seating chart that told me exactly where I belonged. My mother glanced toward the chapel, where people from church were already turning to look at us. "Let's not make today complicated," she said. That was Marianne Whitaker's gift. She could make cruelty sound like etiquette. At the front of Street Andrews, my younger sister Brielle stood beside the casket in a black dress that looked chosen for photographs. Her husband, Julian Mercer, stood next to her with one hand on her back. 9 years earlier, that hand used to find mine under restaurant tables. 9 years earlier, I thought Julian was the man I would marry. Then my mother decided Brielle needed him more. Brielle saw me watching and smiled. Not a grieving smile, a winning one. She walked toward me slowly, Julian beside her, and stopped close enough for me to smell her perfume. "Some women are meant to be chosen, Clara," she said softly. "Some are meant to understand." I looked at Julian. He looked away first. Before I could answer, tires crunched over the gravel behind us. A black limo rolled up to the curb. The driver stepped out, opened the rear door, and my husband, Adrian Vale, emerged in a dark suit, calm as a man arriving exactly where he was supposed to be. Julian's face changed before Brielle understood why. But the limo was not what ruined them. What ruined them was something my father recorded 11 days before he died. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, subscribe so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories. Quick challenge. Are you watching with your legs crossed right now? If yes, comment 3. If not, comment 4. Let's see how many I guessed right. If you enjoy our stories, you can support us with a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Now, get comfortable, because this story takes an unexpected turn. Let's begin. 9 years earlier, before the limo, before the funeral program, before my mother learned how dangerous a quiet daughter could become, I was 24 years old and still believed patience could earn love. I worked scheduling intake appointments for a rehabilitation clinic outside Cleveland. Not glamorous work, not the kind of job my mother could make sound impressive at church luncheons. I answered phones, corrected insurance codes, and called families when a bed opened. I listened to exhausted spouses cry because they did not know how to move someone they loved from a hospital room to a place where healing might begin. I was good at it. That never mattered much in my mother's house. I was not the disappointing daughter. I was the useful one, which meant my value showed up only when something needed fixing. To Marianne Whitaker, my younger sister Brielle was the delicate one. The pretty one. The one who felt things deeply, as if the rest of us were made of cheaper material. Brielle cried easily, laughed loudly, needed rescuing from every uncomfortable silence, and somehow every room rearranged itself around her. I was different, according to my mother. "Clara processes things better," she would say, usually while handing me the thing Brielle could not handle. A cancelled appointment, a bill nobody wanted to discuss, a relative who needed calling. A mess Brielle had made and then floated away from with red eyes and a trembling mouth. At first, I took it as a compliment. I thought being trusted with difficult things meant I was valued. It took me years to understand the difference between being trusted and being used. Julian Mercer came into my life that spring carrying a box of donated mobility braces for the clinic and wearing a navy jacket that looked too nice for the rain. He was 26, working sales for a medical equipment company, the kind of man who remembered names after one introduction and held doors without making a performance of it. He made me laugh in the supply closet while we counted knee braces. He brought coffee on Thursdays. He learned my lunch order, then pretended it was a coincidence when he accidentally bought 2 turkey sandwiches from the place across the street. By August, he knew how I took my coffee. By October, he knew I hated being called strong. By Christmas, he was sitting at my parents' table. My mother had set out the good napkin rings, the silver ones she only used when she wanted the room to behave. Brielle came in late, wrapped in a cream sweater, apologizing to everyone, and somehow receiving comfort for making them wait. No one asked why she was late. My mother only pulled out her chair and said, "You poor thing, traffic must have been awful." Julian stood to greet her. Brielle smiled up at him for half a second too long. I noticed. Then I told myself not to, because back then, I still believed noticing something ugly made me the problem. By New Year's, I knew something had shifted, even if no one had the decency to name it. It did not happen all at once. That was what made it so easy for everyone to deny. Julian stopped leaving his phone face up on my kitchen counter. He started answering messages with one thumb under the table, his smile held in place like tape. When I asked if work was busy, he said it was. When I asked if he was tired of us, he kissed my forehead instead of my mouth and told me not to overthink everything. That was how men like Julian lied. Not with anger, with softness. Brielle began needing him in small, reasonable ways. Her car made a sound near his office, so he drove over to check it. Her apartment sink leaked, and somehow Julian knew a guy. She was nervous about buying a new mattress, and he had opinions about lumbar support. Every favor came wrapped in innocence. Every favor was just small enough that if I objected, I would sound petty. My mother helped with that. "It's sweet of him," she said one Sunday, slicing pound cake into careful pieces. "Brielle doesn't have many people she trusts." The night I finally asked Julian, we were sitting in his apartment with takeout going cold between us. I did not cry. I did not accuse. I only said, "Are you falling in love with my sister?" He looked at me like I had dropped something breakable on the floor. Then he laughed once, too late. "Clara, she's fragile, you know that." I remember staring at the little white cartons on the table, thinking how strange it was that he had answered a question about love with a description of her damage. I asked Brielle the next afternoon, outside my mother's house, while she was loading a shopping bag into her trunk. She touched my wrist, gentle as a nurse with a frightened patient. "You always do this," she said. "You turn everything into proof that someone is choosing me over you." Then she tilted her head, eyes glossy on command. "Maybe Julian just feels safe around me because I don't make him feel guilty for being kind." 6 hours later, my mother called and told me I owed Brielle an apology. 3 days after that, Marianne invited me to dinner. Not asked, invited, the way a judge calls you to the stand. My father was in the kitchen doorway when I arrived, holding a dish towel he was not using. My mother had tea ready. She had already decided who would need calming. "I had hoped we could discuss this when everyone was calmer," she said. And that was how I learned my mother had not discovered the betrayal. She had scheduled it. Brielle and Julian, she explained, had developed feelings. Unexpected, but sincere. Marianne said love was not property. She said my sister had been lonely for years, then she folded her hands and delivered the sentence that took the air out of the room. "If you really love him, Clara, you'll want him where he can do the most good." I looked at Julian. He stared into his cup. I looked at Brielle. She lowered her eyes, but not before I saw relief move across her face. Last, I looked at my father, waiting for one word from him. Just one. He swallowed, looked down at the floor, and said nothing. His hand tightened around the dish towel until the cotton twisted white between his fingers. My mother reached across the table and touched my hand. "Don't be dramatic," she whispered. "Your sister needs a future." And that was the first time I understood that in my family, my heart was not something to protect. It was something to redistribute. I did not answer her, not because there was nothing to say, but because every word I had left felt too honest for that table. My mother wanted a blessing, not a conversation. Julian wanted permission. Brielle wanted my pain handed over already folded and small enough not to ruin her makeup. And my father stood in the doorway with that dish towel twisted in his hand. He looked like a man watching a house burn from inside the kitchen. 3 nights later, my mother hosted what she called a healing dinner. Your sister has been crying herself sick. Julian feels awful. I think it would mean a lot if you came and helped everyone move forward. Everyone. That was the first time I noticed how often my family used that word when they meant everyone but me. I almost did not go. I sat in my apartment for 40 minutes with my coat on, keys in my hand, staring at the wall above my little kitchen table. There was a water stain shaped like Florida in the ceiling, and I remember focusing on it because if I thought about anything else, I would start shaking. My phone buzzed twice. First my mother, then Julian. Please, Clara, don't make this harder. Not I'm sorry, not I love you. Just don't make this harder. So I went, because back then I still thought showing up might count for something. My mother had set the dining room as if someone important were coming. Linen napkins, the good plates with the blue rim, candles she never lit unless churchwomen were visiting. Brielle sat beside Julian, her eyes pink but dry, wearing the pale green sweater I had once told her made her look soft. Julian stood when I entered, then seemed to realize standing looked too much like guilt, and sat back down. My father was already at the far end of the table. He looked older than he had 3 days before. Dinner moved around me like a play in which everyone knew their lines except the person being sacrificed. My mother asked Brielle if she wanted more potatoes. Julian passed her the butter before she asked. My father cut his chicken into pieces so small he never had to lift his eyes. No one asked if I was hungry. Halfway through the meal, Marianne lifted her glass and said, I know this has been painful. She looked at me just long enough to make it clear whose pain had become inconvenient. But love doesn't always arrive in the order we expect, she continued. A mature family accepts what is meant to be. Brielle reached for Julian's hand under the table, but I saw it. I think she wanted me to see it. My mother kept talking. A good family knows when to step aside. The room went very still. I looked at Julian, waiting for shame. I looked at Brielle, waiting for even the smallest understanding of what she was taking. Then I looked at my father. He did not defend me. But when my mother nudged my untouched glass closer to my hand, his fork slipped against the plate with a sharp little sound. Everyone heard it. No one mentioned it. Clara, my mother said, her smile thin now. Say something kind. There are sentences that split your life in half. Not loud ones, not dramatic ones. Just small instructions that show you exactly how little room your grief has been given. I stood up. Brielle made a sound. Almost a gasp, almost a small whin. Julian whispered my name. My mother's face hardened, not with surprise but with embarrassment. That told me she had not expected me to be okay. She had only expected me to perform okay. I hope you both become exactly what you chose, I said. It was not a blessing, but it was the closest thing to one I could give without lying. I left before dessert. No one followed me to the door. In the hallway, beside the old umbrella stand, there was a small cardboard box with my name written on it in my father's blocky handwriting. It had not been there when I arrived. I carried it to my car without opening it. I did not cry until I was halfway back to my apartment, stopped at a red light, with my mother's house shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror. Inside the box was the little silver travel clock, scratched along one side. Its hands stopped at 9:17. Under it was a folded note from my father. One day, don't let them tell your story for you. I read it 3 times. Then I put the note back in the box, closed the lid, and told myself it was too little, too late. The next morning, before sunrise, I packed 2 suitcases, left my key to my parents' house in their mailbox, and drove east until the highway signs stopped feeling familiar. I did not call my mother. I did not call Julian. I did not call Brielle. And for a long time, I did not call my father either. For a long time, I told myself, silence was the cleanest way to survive them. I built a life around that belief. I changed apartments twice. I changed jobs once. I stopped driving past streets that reminded me of Julian's old building. I learned which grocery stores did not play the kind of soft Christmas music my mother loved. I became very good at arranging a life, so nothing sharp touched the old wound unless I allowed it. By 30, I was working in hospice coordination. I was mostly behind a desk and on the phone. I scheduled transport, reviewed intake notes, corrected billing errors before they became disasters, and spoke to adult children who lived 3 states away from dying parents and carried shame in their voices like a second language. I knew that shame. I knew what it sounded like when someone said, "I should have called sooner," and what they really meant was, "I don't know if I'm still allowed to belong." That was how I met Adrian Vale, not at some gala, not in a glittering room with champagne and music. He came to our office after a transport delay, left a 78-year-old woman waiting 5 hours for a hospice bed. Adrian owned the medical transport company contracted with us. He did not send a manager to apologize. He came himself and listened without defending the failure. He asked for the names of the people who had been hurt by it. I noticed that before I noticed his title or his watch. I noticed the way everyone else in the room straightened when he spoke. Adrian did not perform concern. He took notes. A month later, that company's dispatch system had changed. 6 months later, he asked me to dinner. 2 years after that, in October of 2024, I married him in a courthouse with 12 people present and no one from my family invited. My father was not there. At the time, I told myself that made sense. I had been gone for years. Some doors, once closed, start looking like walls. Then one Tuesday afternoon in June, a vendor statement arrived with a name I had spent years training myself not to search for, Daniel Whitaker. The invoice was not dramatic. That was what made it worse. A routine equipment balance forwarded to an outdated emergency contact address because someone had entered an old family record into a new billing system. Service category: hospice, support equipment. Account status: past due. I stared at the screen so long my eyes began to burn. My father was in hospice. No one had told me. I called the number on the statement, with my office door closed. The nurse who answered had a warm, careful voice and introduced herself as Nadine Brooks. Before she said more, Nadine verified my date of birth and the old emergency contact file. She read a note my father had signed 2 weeks earlier, allowing staff to speak with me if I called. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer. "Your father asked about you," she said. That sentence did something to me. I was not prepared for. I gripped the edge of my desk. Does he know I wasn't told? Another pause. "Mr. Whitaker asked whether you had been contacted," Nadine said carefully. "We were instructed that family communication was being handled through Mrs. Whitaker." My mother. Of course. That night, I opened Facebook for the first time in months and typed Brielle's name. Her page was full of soft-filtered photos beside my father's recliner. Brielle holding a mug. Brielle adjusting a blanket. Brielle kissing his forehead with her eyes closed just enough to look heartbroken. Under one photo, my mother had commented, "Our devoted girl. Always here when it matters." 43 people had reacted with hearts. I sat in the dark, looking at that sentence, until the words stopped meaning what they were supposed to mean. Then I dialed the number Nadine gave me. My father answered on the 4th ring. His breathing sounded thin, like paper being folded too many times. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, very softly, "Clara?" I closed my eyes. "Dad." There was a sound on his end, not quite a sob, and not quite a laugh. "I thought," he said, and stopped. I waited. I thought you didn't want to know. That was the moment the wound changed shape. For 9 years, I had believed my father let me leave because silence was easier than choosing me. But hearing his voice, old and frightened and already leaving this world, I understood something colder. Someone had made sure both of us thought the other one had walked away. Silence returned. Silence returned. Silence returned. Silence returned. Silence returned. After that first call, I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone beside my hand, watching the screen go dark and light again every time I touched it. Adrian came in once, saw my face, and did not ask the kind of questions people ask when they want to manage your grief for you. He only set a glass of water near my elbow and said, "Tell me what you need." I said, "I don't know yet." He nodded, and that was the first mercy of the night. My father called again the next evening at 9:17. I noticed the time because the little silver travel clock was still in the drawer beside my bed, the same one I had carried from my mother's hallway years earlier and never found the courage to throw away. Its hands had been stopped for so long that I had started thinking of it as a dead thing. After we hung up, I took it out, opened the back with a butter knife, and replaced the battery. The second hand jerked once, then began moving like something waking up. From then on, 9:17 became the hour when my father and I told the truth in pieces. Some nights he talked for 3 minutes before his breath failed him. Some nights he fell asleep while I was still describing the weather outside my apartment. By then, some calls ended because he was too tired to finish a sentence. Once, I heard my mother enter his room, and his voice changed instantly, polite and distant, as if I had become a wrong number. That hurt more than I expected. Not because he hid me, but because I understood he had learned to survive her too. We did not begin with forgiveness. That would have been too clean. He told me about the medications making his mouth taste like pennies. I told him about a patient's daughter who drove from Indiana every Friday and cried in the parking lot before walking in smiling. He asked about Adrian, carefully, as if my married life were a room he had no right to enter. I told him Adrian was kind in the practical ways that mattered. My father was quiet for a long time, then said, "I should have spoken when it cost less." "It cost me anyway," I said. I did not soften it for him. He did not ask me to. That was how I knew something had changed. The father I remembered would have let silence cover the sentence. This father breathed through it, thin and uneven, and said, "I know." A week later, he asked if Adrian knew anyone who could record a message. "Not for a will, not for property. For correction," he said, "in case your mother edits me after I'm gone." She had already chosen the hymns without asking him, and told the pastor Brielle had been his main comfort. She had already begun shaping the story while he was still alive enough to hear it. Adrian found Miles Keene, a quiet videographer who usually recorded legacy interviews for hospice families. But when Adrian offered to come with me, I shook my head. "Outside," I said. "This one is mine." He accepted that without injury. Miles went to my father's room on a Thursday afternoon while Marianne was at a church committee meeting. Nadine witnessed the consent. My father sat in his recliner, smaller than I was ready for, and looked straight into the camera. He made only one rule. The recording was not to be played because I was angry. It was not to be played because I wanted revenge. It was only to be played if anyone used his death to say I had abandoned him. 11 days later, my father was gone. And almost immediately, my mother began doing exactly what he had feared. My father died on a Tuesday afternoon. Rain dragged thin gray lines down the windows of his room. Nadine called me after the official notification had been made, but before my mother chose to contact me. Her voice was professional until she said my name, and then it softened in a way that told me I was no longer speaking only to a nurse. I was speaking to the woman who had watched my father wait for a daughter he had been told did not want him. Nadine told me later that my father had asked for one thing very clearly. He did not want me to hear about his death through a forwarded text. I thanked her, because I did not know what else to do with grief that arrived already mixed with rage. My mother texted 46 minutes later. "No call. No, I'm sorry. Just a message with the efficiency of a church bulletin. Service Saturday. Street, Andrews. 11 a.m. Reception at Lakeview Yacht Club. Please dress appropriately. There will be church members present. She signed it, Mom, like the word hadn't been getting lighter in my mouth for years. I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone face down beside the little silver clock. It was 9:17 that night when the alarm gave its soft, tired click. No one called. By Saturday morning, my mother had already turned mourning into choreography. At Street Andrews, Brielle stood near the casket in the center of every photograph. One hand rested lightly on the closed lid as if grief had assigned her a pose. Julian hovered beside her, solemn and useful. The printed obituary described Brielle as Daniel's devoted daughter and constant comfort. I appeared 3 paragraphs later, after my father's surviving brother, and before the list of preferred charities, also survived by his daughter, Clara Whitaker of Cleveland. No one had to say what that meant. The sentence did the work for them. During the service, Julian walked to the lectern and spoke about presence. He said some people show love by being there. He said Brielle had been there in the long, hard months. My mother lowered her eyes at exactly the right moment. Brielle pressed a tissue to her mouth. I sat with Adrian beside me. The whole church slowly turned me into the kind of daughter strangers could pity without asking questions. At the reception, the slideshow made the lie prettier. Brielle beside my father's recliner. Brielle holding a mug. Brielle adjusting a blanket. Brielle kissing his forehead. 37 photographs of devotion, all soft edges and warm light. There were 2 pictures of me, both from childhood, both old enough to make my absence look like a choice. A woman from the church touched my arm and whispered, "Did you even know he was that sick?" Before I could answer, Brielle appeared behind her. "We tried," she said, her voice gentle enough for witnesses. "Some people don't come home until there's an audience." The woman's hand slipped away from my sleeve. I felt Adrian shift beside me, but he did not step in. He had learned that loving me meant not grabbing the mic out of my hand before I reached for it. Across the room, Nadine Brooks had just walked in. She stopped beneath the projector light and looked from the slideshow to me. Her face changed. "Why?" she said quietly. "Isn't Clara in any of the care photos?" Nadine's question did not land loudly. It landed cleanly, like a glass set down on a marble counter, in a room where everyone had been pretending not to hear the small crack in the plaster. For half a second, no one moved. Then my mother turned with the kind of smile she used when something unpleasant happened in front of people whose opinions mattered. "Nadine," she said, too brightly, "how kind of you to come." Nadine did not smile back. She was still looking at the slideshow frozen behind us, at Brielle's hand arranged over my father's blanket. "I was invited," Nadine said. My mother's face changed so slightly that anyone else might have missed it. I did not. I had spent my life studying the weather in that woman's eyes. "Of course," Marianne said. "Daniel was very fond of the hospice staff." Nadine corrected her without raising her voice. "Daniel invited me, specifically." Brielle stepped closer to Julian, her fingers tightening around his sleeve. Julian looked from Nadine to me, and for the first time that day, his expression was not pity or guilt. It was uncertainty. Nadine came toward me, lowering her voice. "Clara, may I speak with you privately?" We stepped into a hallway outside the reception room, near a table stacked with coffee cups and folded napkins. I could still hear the slideshow music through the wall. Some gentle piano version of a hymn my father never liked. Nadine reached into her purse and took out a sealed envelope with my name written across it in my father's uneven hand. "He asked me to give you this if the service became what he was afraid it might become," she said. My hand did not move. "What is it?" Nadine held the envelope between us like something fragile. "Consent paperwork," she said, and a note authorizing Miles Keene to release the recording. Daniel asked me to witness the consent and hold the copy. Miles kept the original file. The hallway seemed to narrow around me. I knew about the recording. I knew the rule. But knowing a thing exists and holding the permission to use it are not the same, especially with your mother smiling 20 feet away. Nadine must have seen that in my face, because she said, "Your father was very clear. This was not meant to punish anyone." I nodded, but the motion felt too small for what was happening inside me. "He called it a correction," she added. That word almost broke me. Not revenge. Not exposure. Correction. As if my father, who had spent most of his life letting the wrong people finish his sentences, had finally decided one truth deserved to be said in his own voice. Adrian appeared at the end of the hallway, but he stopped before reaching us. He did not interrupt, he only looked at me, then at the envelope, and waited. "Where is Miles?" I asked. "In the parking lot," Nadine said. "He brought the original file. He said he would not hand it to anyone but you." For a moment, I thought of walking out. I thought of taking the envelope, driving back to Cleveland, and letting them have the room, the slideshow, the pity, the polished lie. It would have been easier. It would have been quieter. I had built almost a decade of my life around quieter. Then, from inside the reception room, I heard my mother's voice rise above the music. "Brielle was his comfort," she was saying. "A blessing in every hard hour." Nadine closed her eyes. I opened the envelope. The first page was the consent form. The second was a short note from my father. "If they say Clara stayed away, play it. If they tell the truth, let me rest." I read it once. Then again. I was not ready to use it, not before giving my mother one chance to correct herself without being forced. Adrian came closer, still careful. "Do you want me with you?" I looked through the open doorway, at my mother holding court beneath my father's photographs. At Brielle, receiving sympathy she had not earned. At Julian, standing beside a woman who had learned to make performance look like pain. "Not yet," I said. Then I folded the note and placed it back in the envelope. I walked toward the parking lot to see what my father had left behind. Miles Keene was waiting beside a gray sedan near the far end of the parking lot, holding a small black case with both hands. He looked younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with tired eyes and the careful posture of someone used to standing near other people's grief without stepping on it. He did not ask me if I was sure. He only said, "Your father wanted you to see the first part before anyone else did." Then he opened the case and handed me a tablet. The video began with my father sitting in his recliner. A blanket lay over his knees, and the oxygen tube rested against his face. He looked smaller than memory, but his eyes were clear. "If you are watching this," he said, "it means someone tried to make Clara pay for my silence." My chest tightened so hard I almost handed the tablet back. Miles looked away, giving me privacy even in a parking lot full of cars. I watched only 40 seconds. That was all I could bear. My father said my name like it still belonged in the center of his life, not buried under Brielle's photographs and my mother's polite omissions. Then he said, "This recording is not anger. It is correction." I pressed pause. For a moment, the only sound was music leaking faintly from the yacht club doors, and the far-off clink of silverware being cleared. When I walked back inside, I found my mother near the reception room entrance. She accepted sympathy like an award she had practiced receiving. I asked her to step into the hallway. She came reluctantly, smoothing the front of her black dress. "What now, Clara?" she whispered. "Haven't you made today tense enough?" I held the envelope at my side. Not as a weapon, but as weight. "Mom," I said, "fix it before Dad does." Her eyes narrowed. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means I know about hospice. I know about the calls. I know Dad gave Nadine permission to speak to me. I know the obituary is wrong. I know Julian's eulogy was wrong. You still have time to correct it." For once, she did not answer quickly. She looked toward the reception room where Brielle stood with women from church, taking the kind of comfort my mother had spent a lifetime arranging. Something in Marianne's face cracked. Not repentance, fear. "He told you?" she asked. "He tried to," I said. "You kept getting between us." My mother walked back to the microphone. I thought, for one foolish second, that maybe grief had made a doorway where love never could. She began, "There are things about Daniel's last months many of you don't know. Clara." The room turned toward me. Brielle's face went pale. She shook her head once, almost too small to see. Marianne saw it, and chose. "Clara has always grieved in her own way," my mother continued. "And while Brielle was the one physically present, we pray Clara finds peace with the distance she chose." The room went still. I looked at Adrian. He did not move toward the microphone. He only met my eyes, asking without words. "My choice." I turned to Miles at the back of the room. "Play it," I said. The screen behind my mother went black. That 1 second felt longer than the entire funeral. My mother turned partway toward the projector, her lips open in annoyance, like a staffer had flubbed a cue in her performance of grief. Brielle looked at Julian. Julian looked at me. Adrian stayed where he was, quiet, hands folded in front of him, not rescuing me from the choice I had just made. Then my father's face appeared on the screen. He sat in the recliner from Brielle's photographs, without the soft filter, without a flattering angle, and without her hand draped over the blanket. The room behind him was plain. A water cup on the side table. A pill organizer. The small lamp with the crooked shade he had owned since I was 12. He looked tired, but not confused. Thin, but not lost. "My name is Daniel Whitaker," he said. "If this is being played, it means my daughter Clara is being blamed for a distance I allowed others to create." The reception room fell so quiet I could hear someone set down a coffee cup. My mother moved first. "Turn that off," she said, too sharply. No one did. She looked toward the yacht club coordinator. "This is inappropriate. He was medicated." Nadine stood near the back wall, her hands clasped in front of her. "He was alert that day," she said. "I signed the capacity note." My father continued before my mother could answer. "For years, I let my silence become evidence against Clara. That was my failure, not hers." His breathing caught, and in the room several people leaned forward without realizing it. When I became ill, Clara was not told. When she found out, she called me every night at 9:17. A woman from church turned slowly toward my mother. Brielle's face tightened. "That doesn't prove she was there," she said, but her voice had lost its sweetness. On the screen, my father lifted a folded sheet of paper with a trembling hand. "Presence is not always a photograph," he said. "Sometimes it is a voice on the phone when the house has gone quiet. Sometimes it is a bill paid before pride lets anyone admit it was overdue. Sometimes it is a daughter asking what medication made her father dizzy because no one else thought to write it down." Julian looked at Brielle then. Really looked. My mother whispered my name like a warning. I did not move. For 9 years, my family had used silence as a room they could lock me inside. Now my father's voice had opened the door from the other side. Brielle stepped forward. "Dad was emotional," she said. "He didn't understand how much Mom and I were doing." The video kept playing. My father looked directly into the camera. "And if anyone says Brielle was my only comfort," he said, "then they should also tell you why the person who comforted me most was the one they kept out of the room." Julian spoke before anyone else could. "Kept out?" he said, turning toward Brielle. "What does that mean?" Brielle shook her head quickly. "It means he was hurt. He was confused. He was trying to make Clara feel better." On the screen, my father gave a tired little smile, as if he had known someone would say exactly that. "I am not confused," he said. "Nadine Brooks is here because I asked her to be here. Miles Keene recorded this because I asked him to record it. And Clara is hearing this in public because someone refused to tell the truth in private." My mother's face went white in a way makeup could not soften. Then the video shifted. Miles must have edited in the records my father wanted shown. A simple image appeared beside him on the screen. A printed call log. Dates, times, duration. 9:12 p.m. Again and again, stacked down the page, like proof that did not need to raise its voice. "My daughter called me 312 times," my father said. She paid 7 overdue hospice invoices. She spoke with Nadine about my medication changes. She asked what I ate. She asked if the blanket in Brielle's picture was warm enough, because Clara noticed details even in photographs meant to erase her. A sound moved through the room. Not a gasp exactly, something lower. Recognition arriving too late. Brielle stepped back from Julian. "Mom said those calls upset him," she whispered. Julian looked at her. "You told me Clara never called." I said what Mom said. That sentence did more damage than any accusation I could have made. Nadine stepped forward then, not dramatic, not angry. "Daniel asked that Clara be contacted. The instruction we received from Mrs. Whitaker was that all family communication should go through her because Clara had chosen distance." She looked at my mother. "He asked me to document that." My mother gripped the edge of the nearest chair. "I was protecting him." "No," I said, and my voice surprised me by staying steady. "You were protecting the story that cast Brielle as devoted and me as absent." The last part of the video played. My father's breathing was rougher now, but his eyes stayed clear. "Clara," he said, "I let your mother call silence peace. I let your sister call needing things love. I let you pay the price. I am sorry. Don't pay it again for my funeral." I felt something in me break, but not the way broken things usually break, more like a lock giving way. My mother turned on me then. "You humiliated your own mother at your father's funeral." I looked at the screen, then at her. "No," I said. "You used his funeral to humiliate me." He just answered. The room did not explode after my father's video ended. That would have been easier. Explosions give people permission to run, to scream, to make the moment about smoke instead of damage. What happened was quieter. People looked away from my mother, then from Brielle, then back at me with the uncomfortable faces of people realizing they had helped carry a lie simply because it had been handed to them in a prettier frame. My mother left the reception first, not with dignity, but with speed. 2 women from the church followed her halfway, then stopped before touching her arm. That was the first consequence. Marianne Whitaker had spent her life arranging gatherings so folks would rush to her side. For the first time, she walked out of one, and no one knew whether comforting her would make them part of the lie. Brielle found me by the hallway. Her mascara had finally done what she'd been pretending it would all morning. "Mom made me believe you didn't care," she said. Her voice was smaller than I expected. Maybe there was some truth in it. Maybe there was also convenience. I looked past her at Julian, standing by the exit with his car keys in his hand, seeing his wife clearly for the first time in years. "You were 27, I said. "Not 7. She flinched, but I did not apologize. There are ages where not knowing becomes a choice, especially when the lie keeps putting you in the center of every photograph. 3 weeks later, I met my mother at the cemetery because she asked for a private conversation, which meant there was finally no microphone close enough to help her. She looked smaller beside my father's grave. Not sorry enough to be safe. Not proud enough to be dangerous. Just tired. "I thought if Brielle looked loved enough," she said, "she would finally be okay." I held the little silver clock in my coat pocket. I could feel the scratched metal against my palm. At 9 to 17, it gave its soft, tired click. "And what did you think I would be?" I asked. My mother opened her mouth. Nothing came out. That silence told me more than any confession could have. I did something harder. I stopped being available for the role they had written for me. When my mother called about church letters, I told her to ask Brielle. When Julian called Adrian about the contract review, Adrian said character mattered in business. When Brielle texted that she did not know how to fix things, I did not send instructions. I started the Daniel Whitaker Quiet Care Fund that fall. It helped families cover hospice transport when distance and pride made goodbyes harder than they needed to be. Nadine advised me. Adrian handled logistics when I asked, not before. My father's last gift was not revenge. It was permission. Permission to stop being the price of everyone else's peace. What I learned from my father's death was that truth rarely shows up without fanfare. Most of the time, it doesn't. Truth is usually quiet. It waits in old phone calls, in unpaid invoices, in the way someone remembers what everyone else tried to erase. And sometimes, truth does not arrive to destroy anyone. It arrives simply to put the right name back where it belongs. For years, I believed love meant stepping aside. I thought being the stronger one meant taking the hurt so others wouldn't have to. I thought peace meant swallowing the truth, so the family table could stay set and the photographs could still look nice. It meant the people who caused the damage would not have to feel ashamed in public. But that is not peace. That is performance. A family is not healthy just because no one raises their voice. A mother is not loving just because she says she is protecting someone. A sibling is not innocent just because they learned to cry first. And being quiet does not mean you were wrong. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one carrying the most truth. There comes a point in life when you have to stop confusing sacrifice with love. Real love does not require you to disappear so someone else can feel chosen. Real family does not ask you to pay for everyone else's comfort with your dignity, your future, or your voice. Healing did not mean I hated my mother. It meant I stopped letting her version of me become my identity. It meant I could grieve my father, accept his apology, and still admit that his silence had hurt me. It meant I could love people from a distance without handing them the pen to write my story again. If this story reminds you of something you have lived through, I hope you remember this. You are not selfish for telling the truth. You are not cruel for setting a boundary. And you are not broken just because your family taught you to survive instead of be loved. Sometimes the greatest act of recovery is not revenge. It is finally refusing to be the price of everyone else's peace. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been the one expected to stay quiet so the family could look whole?